From Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson staring at each other for 25 minutes, to Valentina Shevchenko and Liz Carmouche putting the crowd to sleep, these are the UFC rematches that the fans hated. Like the time Wonder Boy and The Chosen One did absolutely nothing at UFC 209. When these two first clashed heads at UFC 205, sparks flew across Madison Square Garden. Fans were thrilled at what they got to witness. These legends were really putting on a show. The match was so close that it was declared a majority decision draw, and Woodley got to keep the title. The match was so good that Dana White awarded Thompson and Tyron with the Fight of the Night honors. The fans were calling for an immediate rematch to settle the score. The two men engaged in battle a few months later, but this time it was a complete snooze fest. Wonder Boy and The Chosen One did little more than stare at each other for the entirety of the bout. Tyron was waiting for Steven to commit so he could land a power punch, and the real-life Karate Kid wasn't gonna run into it. Woodley was able to score a knockdown in the final round, which allowed him to secure a majority decision win. It's particularly disappointing when the fans pay to see some action in the cage, but instead, they're treated with two fighters just staring at each other. Something similar happened between Carla Esparza and Rose Namajunas. These ladies actually fought way back in 2014 for the inaugural strawweight title, and years later, Thug Rose would give Carla a chance to win back her title. Their last fight wasn't as crazy, but it did have some action as the Cookie Monster was able to submit Namajunas via a rear naked choke. This time around, though, it was boring as hell. They kept moving forward and backward without trying to land anything. Esparza was afraid that she was going to get hit by something if she shot for a takedown, and Thug Rose was wary of Carla's wrestling prowess. The fans started booing them, and the casters had nothing to talk about. To make things worse for the crowd, they'd just witnessed Michael Chandler head kick Tony Ferguson into oblivion, and were anticipating the guaranteed bloodbath between Charles Oliveira and Justin Gaethje. Every single media outlet and every fan who had the displeasure of watching this fight declared it to be one of the most boring in the promotion's history. Rose fell as a champ that night and hasn't fought since. If the match wasn't as horrible, I'm sure that the fans would have at least liked to see another champion fall. Back when Anderson Silva was in his prime, it seemed like he was never gonna lose. He was just so good. So no one expected Chael Sonnen to pose any real threat to the Brazilian when he challenged Silva for the middleweight title. But their fight at UFC 117 was an eye-opener to the world. The bad guy dominated Silva on the feet, but he kept most of the fighting on the ground. He was able to stifle the Spider out with his wrestling, and it didn't seem like Anderson had any answers left. Sonnen was winning for 4.5 rounds, but the Spider was able to pull a rabbit out of the hat by sneaking in a triangle choke to retain his title. Running the fight again was a no-brainer for the UFC, as the American gangsta proved himself to be a real threat to Silva, but the rematch was just disappointing. The Brazilian was pretty wise to all of Chael's tricks by now, and when the bad guy attempted a spinning back fist, Silva dodged it easily. This gave him an opening to land a knee to Sonnen's chest to drop him, and unloaded a barrage of strikes on his opponent. The fight wasn't boring, but it just didn't live up to all the hype that fans came to expect from it. Title rematches rarely play out like that. Remember John Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson too? When the first time the Swede took on the GOAT, there was a lot of debate on who won that fight. Of course, Bones was granted the decision win, but many believed that Gustafsson did enough to clinch the light heavyweight title. It was only in the dying moments of the 4th round that Jones caught Alex with a brutal spinning elbow and was able to turn the tide in his favor. The fans demanded an immediate rematch, but due to many injuries that plagued the Swede and John's trouble with the law, it didn't happen. 5 years later, they met again in the octagon. Jones was still in his prime, but Alex wasn't the fighter he once was. From the beginning of the match, it was clear that Gustafsson couldn't keep up with the GOAT's intensity and succumbed to a knockout in the 3rd round. Their first fight was an instant classic, but the rematch was nothing but a disappointment. Another great example of this is when John Dodson challenged the Mighty Mouse again. The first time around, the magician really took the fight to Demetrius Johnson and even managed to knock him down a couple of times during exchanges. This fight was a masterclass from a technical perspective, as the Mouse was doing everything to perfection, but Dodson still managed to catch him. Fans expected more of the same when the two clashed heads again 2 years later in 2015, but this time, the magician was merely a shadow of what he used to be. The flyweight GOAT was clean. He landed whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and showcased how perfect of a mixed martial artist he is. Dodson, on the other hand, could only stay alive for the whole 25 mins. He had absolutely nothing on the Mighty Mouse and was hanging on for dear life as Johnson took him on a ride in the octagon. The only saving grace was the magician's defensive wrestling, but that too looked like he was trying not to get finished by the Mouse. It's stuff like that makes me question the UFC running back fights. That's what happened when the UFC decided to rerun Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler. These two legends crossed paths almost 2 decades ago, and the fans were looking forward to the rematch. They weren't in their primes, but their reputations preceded them in the octagon. Back at UFC 47, Nick secured the win with a well-placed short right hand. Throughout that match, they went toe-to-toe in an all-out brawl. The Stockton native soaked up Lawler's strike and mocked him in an all-too-familiar Diaz style. So the fans were expecting some kind of contest between the two in 2021, but it was pretty clear from the get-go that these guys weren't who they once were. They were slow and sloppy. Ruthless was able to walk down Diaz and unloaded punches on him, until in the 3rd round, the 39-year-old fell to the ground. It wasn't a knockout since Lawler motioned Nick to get up, but he refused to do that. Even the ref told Diaz to get back to his feet, but he kept shaking his head. The ref had no choice but to wave off the fight. As sad as the sight of a broken Diaz was, fans were left wondering what was he doing there in the first place if he didn't want to fight. Just like the audience was left puzzled about Liz Carmouche's presence in the cage when she was engaging the former flyweight queen, Valentina Shevchenko. It's hard to believe, but Gorilla was one of the few fighters who have been able to defeat the Bullet. It was back in 2010 Liz actually dominated the Russian assassin and forced a doctor's stoppage to win. When Dana gave Carmouche a shot at Val to strip her of that title, the fans were really excited to see that. The fight turned out to be nothing short of embarrassing for both of them, since all they did was circle each other for the better part of 5 rounds. The Bullet was committed to her signature counter-striking style, and Liz was too hesitant to rush in. Shevchenko managed to take the fight to the ground in the later rounds, but they didn't do much there either, as they just held on to each other. It was easily one of the most boring UFC fights ever, and Dana decided to kick Gorilla out of the promotion a few months later. So, from Valentina Shevchenko and Liz Carmouche putting the crowd to sleep, to Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson staring at each other for 25 minutes, these were the UFC rematches that fans hated.